Jon Birger, welcome to the show.
Brett, thanks for having me on.
You just published a really interesting book. It's called Date-onomics, and it takes a really interesting approach to dating and love life and romance and marriage. It looks at demographics and almost takes it like an economic approach. And so this led you to these interesting sociological, even Darwinian theories about how sex ratios or demographics can affect, I guess we'll call it mating behavior or dating behavior. So what are some of these theories about how sex ratios can affect how men and women mate or partner up?
Well, so there's been a surprising amount of social science and behavioral science on gender ratios. And actually most of it kind of grew out of animal studies, out of zoology. So zoologists who've looked at species that are nominally monogamous, or at least monogamous during mating season, one of the things that they found is that the odds of the male abandoning his female mate tend to rise and fall depending upon the prevailing sex ratio in the mating population. So sociologists and psychologists kind of use the animal research to look at human behavior. And what they found is that when men are the ones in oversupply, the whole dating culture is more likely to emphasize monogamy and courtship and romance, and marriage rates are higher, that kind of thing. But when women are in oversupply, the dating culture does not emphasize monogamy. There's kind of a more freewheeling sexuality. Marriage rates go down, divorce rates go up, out-of-wedlock births go up. And basically the whole culture becomes more sexualized because men are in no rush to settle down.
Right. So this is where the economics sort of angle comes in at it, right? So I guess when there's more women available, there's more opportunity for men. Like there's really no reason to settle down and you can cast your wild oats, right? There's more of a, you're more, for men, there's more in their self-interest to do that than to settle down with just one woman.
Right. No, exactly. So, and I should preface this by saying overall in the U.S., there are just as many women as men. The problem I write about in the book specifically refers to college-educated people.
Right. So this is what you mean by the man deficit.
Right. So obviously the U.S. is not China. We're not India. There isn't like this structural imbalance where you actually have more men than women overall because of female infanticide or sex selection or things like that. Overall, our numbers are about the same. The problem is that women have been attending college at a much higher rate than men, going back, like for the past 10 years, it's been 4 women graduating for every 3 men. 20 years ago, it was about 5 women for every 4 men. So basically for millennials, you have about 35% more female college graduates than male college graduates. And this might not matter if we were all more open-minded about whom we date and marry, but at the same time this has happened, there's been an increase in what sociologists like to call assortative mating, which is a fancy way of saying we tend to marry our own type. In other words, college grads tend to marry other college grads. And people have become more rigid about this over time. The odds of a college grad marrying a non-college grad are lower today than at any point over the past 50 years. So for men, this kind of, I guess you could call it classism or closed-mindedness, it doesn't really penalize them because there's such a big oversupply of women. But for women, for college-educated women, it has 2 effects. One, by limiting their dating pool to only college-educated men, they're making it statistically harder for them to find a match. But they're also kind of giving those college grad men too much leverage, and they're kind of giving them the ability to act badly because these guys know they're in high supply.
Interesting.
High demand. I'm sorry, high demand.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. So, I mean, have fewer men been going to college? Well, why have more women going to college than men? Is it a matter of, is it economics where men could, there's more of a payoff to just go to work right away than to go to college? Or is it just the changing economy? What's going on there?
Well, you could interview 10 people on this and you might get 10 different answers. I'll give you my answer, but I'm going to preface it by saying there are other thoughts on this. But I don't think it's the economy. I think this basically boils down to some child development issues, which we all need to focus on more. So if we'd had this conversation in the 50s, the numbers would have essentially been reversed. It would have been about 60 men in college for every 40 women. And obviously, 50 years ago, there were different things going on. The college, the school, public school curricula kind of advantaged boys and discriminated against girls, and certainly colleges, when it came to admissions, were clearly discriminating against female applicants because there was this silly embedded idea out there that women only went to college to get their MRS degree. And the passage of Title IX in the 70s leveled the playing field, and it made discrimination in education illegal. So over time, that leveled the playing field, and by the early 80s, we got to 50-50 when it comes to college enrollment. So the question is, how do we get from equal numbers of men and women attending college in the early 80s to 35% more women than men today? And my argument is that the old discrimination that used to exist against women, it kind of obscured a fundamental biological truth. And that is that boys' brains lag about a year behind girls' brains when it comes to intellectual and social maturity. And if you're a parent, we all kind of intuit this and feel this. I have teenage boys, and hopefully they won't listen to this, but maybe they probably know it as well. If you are around teenagers, you kind of know that a 16 or a 17-year-old girl is essentially a young woman, while a 16-year-old boy is still very much a boy. And this comes out in education, and researchers and neurologists who've studied this will tell you that the brain of, say, a 10-year-old girl is close to that of an 11-year-old boy when it comes to development and brain development. So the boys are like lagging a year behind the girls. And that's why when it comes to actual schoolwork and college preparation, the girls are better at it. Gotcha. So the more boys aren't going to college, they're just not ready for it. Right. They're falling behind in school. So 70% of high school valedictorians last year were girls. Girls get better grades. They have fewer behavioral problems when it comes to school. So when it comes to primary and secondary education, boys are falling behind. And the fact that they're falling behind, one of the consequences is that girls are attending college at a higher rate. Gotcha. That makes sense. I guess one of the solutions, and we'll get to, I guess we probably better talk about it at the end, is possibly holding boys back in school. Yes. Right. Yeah. We'll talk more detail about that in a bit. But let's go back to this assortative mating, because I think it's interesting because, there's been a lot of writing, ink spilled about this topic, that the rich are marrying the rich while the poor are marrying the poor, where there was a time in our country's history where there's a lot more cross-social relationships. But I think it's interesting. Wasn't that like primarily men who would marry, like college-educated men who would marry women who didn't have a college education? And I guess, is it like there's something going on there, either because we're conditioned socially where there's this tendency not to want to marry quote-unquote down, right? Well, I think the trend has been that way for both men and women. Oh, it's for both men and women. Okay. Yeah. So men are less likely to marry down. I don't love that. I hate that phrase, but it's the only way to convey it. So men are less likely to. A college-educated man is also less likely to marry somebody lacking a college degree compared to 50 years ago. But as I said, that the man who is closed-minded about dating, he's not penalized in the same way the woman is, because the supply of college-educated women is so great.
Right.
So the trend has been the same for men and women in terms of this increase in assortative mating. It just affects the women differently.
Gotcha. So you talk about there's pockets in the country where this man deficit is pretty extreme. What are some of those pockets? And maybe you can highlight some of the stories you've heard of, I don't know what you would want to call it, but just debauchery, or just like, men who are just going out and just basically having a great time while it's really hard for women.
Yeah, well, let's start with the geography. So I have to admit, when I began work on the book, I thought my research was going to end up someplace different from where it did. Initially, I assumed what I call the man deficit was some kind of a phenomenon unique to big cosmopolitan cities like New York or LA or Chicago or London, places like that. What was so interesting was that this is not a big city phenomenon. And in fact, the man deficit in, say, Montana is bigger than it is in New York City. So, and actually, there are lots of rural states where the dating market is much more lopsided than what you find in big cities. So Montana has 52% more college grad women than men who are aged 22 to 29. Oklahoma, it's 45%. Texas, 40%. West Virginia, 61%. So New York State, it's 30%, which is still big, but what's interesting is that some of these more rural states, the dating market is even more lopsided when it comes to college-educated people than in New York or California.
Interesting.
So to your question about behavior, let me just say from the start that I try hard in the book and when talking about the book not to come across like the morality police.
Yeah, I noticed that. You did a good job with that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to shame people about their sex lives or say that only men are into the hookup culture or no men want to get married or women can't enjoy sexual freedoms. I mean, I'm not even endorsing marriage for that matter. So sometimes when I tell these stories, it makes it sound like I'm judging these people for their sex lives, and I'm really not. I'm just trying to explain why the world is the way it is.
Sure.
So, okay. So, but it is clear to me that in dating markets where men have all the leverage, the men become pickier and they become less inclined to settle down, and the women, sensing that they're at a disadvantage, and I don't know whether this is conscious or subconscious, but the whole dating climate and sexual climate becomes looser because the men are the ones who are essentially making the rules. So I interviewed plenty of women who felt like they were being used and taken advantage of by men who only wanted to sleep with them, and then after a date or two, they never heard from them again, or from men who kind of felt like, they didn't have much success dating-wise in high school or college, and suddenly things are going pretty well for them in their late 20s, and of course they're going to be in no rush to settle down because they finally have a chance to do what they always wanted to do. So I would hear stories like that. If you want more, you want me to go into more details about
No, I mean, I think we get kind of people get the general idea. I think it's interesting too. You talk about, you go into depth about campuses, colleges.
Yeah.
Right. And this was it is sort of controversial. There's all this in the past year or so, a lot of controversy about, the rape culture that exists on campuses. And there's, I guess there's some folks out there that are making the case that because that there are more women on college campuses, and then men, it's sort of, I don't want to say it promotes it, but it encourages more like looser sexual mores. And then you get something that looks, I don't know if you want to say that that's the rape culture, but it kind of promotes that in a way.
Well, that's my argument. And now there's been a ton of research on how sex ratios affect, or correlations between gender ratios and rates of sexual assault. And all these studies, what they point to, and it sounds counterintuitive, but what they point to is that when men are scarce, rates of sexual assault are higher. And it doesn't make sense when, like, why would there being fewer men lead to more rapes? But what seems to be happening is that men value women less and protect them less when women are in an oversupply. And there was a fascinating study that came out of China. It was done by an economist at Columbia University. And she looked at crime rates in China as China's overall gender ratio among young people began to skew more and more male for well-known reasons. And what she found is that most types of crime, as the population became disproportionately male, most types of crime went up. And that kind of makes sense because men are more prone to criminality. So when it came to property crimes or murder or things like that, the crime rates went up as the male population grew in relation to the female population. The only type of major crime where there was a significant decline was sexual assault. As in China, as the population became more male, it actually became safer for women when it came to sexual assault. And again, the argument is that when women are scarce, men treat them better. And I know it sounds awful in some ways, but that seems to be what the science indicates.
It's interesting. And I think it's interesting, I think you highlight there's college counselors or people on universities who are aware of this research, but they can't talk about it because of Title IX, and that's kind of the gist that I got from the book.
Look, I mean, I do think that there's a fundamental awareness that there's a correlate. I mean, not everybody, but I do think people on college campuses, and I quote a student, like a student counselor, a psychologist at NYU, and certainly in her research, she's aware that there's a correlation between increasingly lopsided gender ratios on campus. NYU has 50% more women than men, and the hookup culture. I don't want to push this too far and say that the hookup culture is the same as the rape culture.
Sure,
because it's different.
Yeah.
But I think that the lopsided gender ratios kind of contribute to similar things. So with the hookup culture, it basically gives men more leverage and allows them to de-emphasize commitment in favor of opportunity, so to speak. And then when it comes to rape, I do believe that I had one woman in New York when she was she wasn't talking about sexual assault, but she made a comment that I found moving in some ways. She told me a lot of men don't view women as people when she was complaining about her dating situation, and I kind of feel that's what's going on when it comes to sexual assault. That women have been devalued in some way in the minds of men on these campuses, and that is contributing to sexual violence on college campuses. Now, I'm not excusing it. I don't think it's inevitable. I do believe if colleges, we're a little more. I think colleges should be looking at this topic and investigating it and talking about it. And I believe if we focused more attention on it and shined a spotlight on it, the behavior would change, because that's what happens. I mean, unless you talk about it, you're not going to be able to change the behavior.
Right. So the idea, you kind of made the case that, by talking about it, maybe you'll have more women decide to go to colleges where there are more men, right? And so everything was sort of even out eventually. Wasn't that kind of
right? Well, yeah. I mean, that's part of it, but I also think, it's more than that. So, I mean, the human brain. This is a different example, but the
Sure.
human brain is also hardwired to. We have an extreme panic reflex, and we tend to fear the unknown, and that's because the human brain evolved at a time when escaping bad weather or escaping wild animals or an unfamiliar tribe or something like that. It was in humans' best interest in terms of self-preservation to escape. So we have kind of an exaggerated panic reflex. Now, so you could, if I wanted to, or somebody could make the argument that racism is kind of hardwired into our brains because we're pre-programmed to fear the unknown. Well, the reality is that humans learn, and we have an ability to kind of overcome our kind of natural inclinations, and when it comes to issues of race and ethnicity, I think this is a good example of that we don't give in to kind of our worst instincts, and we learn from them. And I kind of feel like something similar could happen on college campuses if we were more upfront and kind of confronted the fact that these gender ratios do tend to devalue women.
So I think it's interesting. In the book, you talk about the sex demographic problems that are unique to two specific religious groups, Mormons and Jews. First, I mean, why did you, or not just Jews, it's Orthodox Jews. Let's get specific here. How did you uncover these two? Why did you highlight these two groups? Are they just microcosms that illuminate the general issues that are coming up with skewed sex ratios?
Well, this was actually the last chapter I wrote, but it turned out to be my favorite. So, as I was writing and researching the book, I would have people come up to me, and people I interviewed for the book or just friends and family who I talked to about the book. They would say things like, well, with the hookup culture and people not getting married in as great numbers as they used to, couldn't it just be that times have changed? Couldn't it be that sexual mores have changed, and that's why there's more of a hookup culture? And that argument always irritated me, because the thing is, sexual mores do not change for no reason. There seemed to be this notion out there that all these kind of social values and sexual mores kind of inevitably moved from conservative to libertine over time, and I don't agree with that. I think there's always a root cause behind why our values, why our mores change. And the reason I began to look at religious groups is because I wanted to see if I could find a religious group that had an imbalanced gender ratio. And I could show that despite the fact that this group was rooted in very conservative values, that lopsided gender ratios were affecting marriage or affecting behavior in these communities the same way it affects secular people on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. So I began to look at the gender ratios within religious communities. And one of the things I found is that while pretty much all religious groups have slightly more women than men, because men tend to fall away from organized religion at a higher rate, Mormons, particularly Mormons in Utah, tend to have a particularly lopsided gender ratio. One of the studies out there indicated that there are 3 Mormon women for every 2 Mormon men in the state of Utah. It's a little less imbalanced outside of Utah, but in Utah, it's very lopsided. So I began exploring how this affects dating and marriage. And as I was working on it, I actually got a call from a hedge fund manager who wanted to interview me about a job. And I explained that he was a friend of a friend. And I explained to him that I was working on this book. And I told him about the Mormons. And he paused and he said, That sounds a lot like the Shidduch crisis. And I mean, I'm Jewish, but obviously not Jewish enough, because the Shidduch crisis refers to a marriage crisis within the Orthodox, particularly the ultra-Orthodox community within the ultra-Orthodox. It's a Orthodox Jews are not the majority of Jews in the U.S., but they're a very tight-knit group. And they have their own marriage crisis, and in their case, it's also because of lopsided gender ratios. Although it's not that overall there are more women than men, it's that you have 18-year-old women marrying 22-year-old men, and because the Orthodox birth rate is so high, each 1-year age cohort has more people than the one that preceded it. So there are more 18-year-olds than 19-year-olds, more 19-year-olds than 20-year-olds, and so on and so on. So if you have 22-year-old men marrying 18-year-old women, there aren't going to be enough women. I'm sorry, there aren't going to be enough men. And that's why you have this imbalance in the Orthodox community. And for both Mormons and Orthodox Jews, this oversupply of women has created problems. It's basically created a sense of entitlement among the men, and it's created a sense of competition among the women.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about. So, I mean, I guess because these are fairly conservative religious groups. I mean, they're not. The men aren't having sex all the time. They're probably. I guess they're putting off marriage longer than the norms would want them to hold off marriage on.
Yeah, I don't get the sense that good Mormons in Salt Lake City are spending a lot of time on Tinder, or kind of watching explicit rap videos or things like that. So it's not pop culture that's affecting sexual mores in Utah or in ultra Orthodox neighborhoods in Brooklyn or other parts of the country.
But you did notice some of the behavior that you see that people have noticed that's changed in these two communities amongst women. So the men are, they're putting off marriage, and I guess the women are getting more competitive. So I guess you talked about in Utah, there's a lot of plastic surgery amongst women.
Yeah. So there's a consumer review site that's kind of like the leading online review site for plastic surgery, and they did a survey a couple years ago, and they found that on a per capita basis, Salt Lake City leads the nation in breast augmentation.
Yeah,
which is to somebody who's not from Utah and who's not Mormon, I mean, to me that's like confounding and baffling, because the idea of Mormons rushing out to get breast augmentation, it just doesn't mesh with what the rest of us think of that community as being so
kind of buttoned down conservative.
Right. I mean, I don't know if there's a way to prove this scientifically, but I do have a sense that women in Utah are already above average in terms of attractiveness.
Right. It's that whole Swedish descent. They came over the pioneers.
I don't know. Maybe I'll get in trouble for saying that.
Right.
my sense. So if you're, it's already a very competitive marriage market for women. So I just think there's this added pressure on women to do everything they can to improve their marriage odds. And I spoke to women, Mormon women in Utah, who were telling me when they go to a singles event, it's very common for there to be twice as many women as men, which is even worse than the numbers I've cited from that Trinity College study.
And this effect on women isn't just affecting Mormon women, but you talk about in the Orthodox Jewish community, there's this pressure to lose a lot of weight. And so there's eating disorders problems.
Yeah, there's eating disorders and plastic surgery. So we'll start, in the ultra-Orthodox community, typically they're using matchmakers to pair young men and women for marriage. And I would say that they're not exactly arranged marriages, but they're kind of guided. People can say no, obviously, and there are no shotgun weddings, but the tradition is to use matchmakers to kind of pair young men and women for marriage. And one of the expectations for the women is that they will provide a resume which the men can look over. And 20 years ago, the resume was pretty mundane. It included things like, who your parents are, who your grandparents were. If you had a great grandparent who was a famous rabbi, that would actually improve your odds, your standing in the marriage market. It actually still does. But most and, may ask like your religious background, things like that, how religious you are, and what branch of Orthodox Judaism you come from. Nowadays, these resumes, a lot of the women include glossy glamour photos with the resumes. And one of the questions, or a couple of the questions the women are expected to answer is not only their own dress size or weight, but the young men want to know the dress size of their moms too. And that's because they want to be able to project, after she has 5 or 6 kids, is she going to be able to keep her figure?
Wow.
And it's funny in some respects, but it's sickening in when you think about it, because these are not 22 or 23-year-old women who are going through this, which would be bad enough. These are 17 and 18-year-old young women who are expected to appear as marriageable as possible at a very young age, when this should not be what they're worried about. And as you said, there is this problem of anorexia within the Orthodox community, and the plastic surgery thing is out there as well. So there was an author, a woman who wrote she writes a lot of Jewish religious books, and she wrote a column for a Jewish newspaper, basically urging the parents of young women to invest in plastic surgery in order to improve their daughter's marriage odds. And I in the book, as you may recall, I ripped into this author. And she was really mad at me after the fact, and she emailed me and called me all sorts of names. And one of her arguments in response was, well, I arranged nose jobs for a bunch of these girls for free, and wouldn't you know it, some of these 18-year-old girls wound up getting married after I got them nose jobs. And I'm thinking to myself, it drives me bonkers that she thinks this is rationalizing the objectification of young women, but that seems to be the culture.
Interesting. Were you, in your research, were you able to uncover, are these two groups doing anything to solve this problem? Are they taking proactive steps, or are they just well, it's just the way it is?
Yeah, I think there are definitely components or elements in both communities who realize what's going on. So for Mormons, I don't think you would get any leaders in the church to admit this, but I do believe that one of the motivations when they lowered the mission age, I think it was, you would know better than me, but I think it used to be 19.
Used to be 19.
And now it's what, 17 or 18?
18.
18. I think what was happening, so the age in which young men are most likely to become apostates or to leave organized religion is in their late teens and early 20s. And for Mormons, that's a problem, because that's the exact time when they go on mission. And there's no doubt there are plenty of young men who would rather get on with their lives, either education or work, rather than take 2 years off to do mission. Plus, the mission, as you know, is expensive. It's the missionaries and their families pay for the mission, not the church. Now, again, you would know better than me, but certainly 30, 40 years ago, I think there was less pressure on LDS men to go on mission. You could skip a mission, and there wouldn't necessarily be a huge stigma attached to it. It wouldn't be a great thing, but you could still have a leadership role in the LDS church if you had not been a missionary. Nowadays, there's a lot of social pressure, as you know, to go on mission. And you'll see Mormon blogs with young women debating whether it's okay to marry or date a non-RM, which is a non-returning missionary. Yeah. So this social pressure on the men who forego missions, I think, has increased the the apostasy rate among men, and because if they stay in the church, there's this stigma attached to them, and I think this kind of incentivizes them to leave. But getting back to the point about the mission age, I think if if young men begin their mission before they start work or before they begin school, maybe they're more likely or less likely to forego a mission. And based on the missionary numbers, I think there definitely are a lot more young men doing missions now than there were before the.
Yeah, there was a big bump.
Yeah.
Right afterwards. So, what about in the Orthodox Jewish community?
So. What's so fascinating about the Orthodox community is that there's this natural control group. So for about half the Orthodox community, there's this significant age gap between the sexes at marriage. You have 18, 19-year-old young women marrying men who are 22, 23, or 24. And that's because the young men don't get married until they finish attending yeshiva, which is a Jewish seminary, and maybe there's a year of religious study in Israel involved as well. So until they're done with their religious studies, they typically don't get married. However, there is a segment of the Orthodox community known as Hasidic Jews who don't do this. Basically, everybody gets married at age 18. And in the Hasidic community, there is no Shudder crisis. And when you talk to Hasidic Jews about the supposed marriage crisis and this oversupply of women, they have no idea what you're talking about, and that's because the men and women are marrying at the same age. And I think in the non-Hasidic Orthodox community, I think some of the rabbis have realized what's going on, and they understand that this basically boils down to a demographic problem, that there are just more 18-year-old women than 22-year-old men, and they've been trying to encourage men to marry women their own age. And there have been some incentives put in place to do that. I don't know how much success it's having, and my own take on this, and I'm not a highly religious person, and I'm sure an Orthodox rabbi would offer up many reasons why my suggestion is wrong. But it's my belief that it would be an act of kindness if Orthodox rabbis would basically refuse to marry off women until they turn 20 or 21 or 22, because that would allow some of the older women who've yet to find their match to get married, and it would and also there shouldn't be this pressure on 17 and 18-year-old young women or girls to appear marriageable. And I think it would be healthier if the community would just sort of say, look, let's push back the age of marriage, particularly for women.
Gotcha. So I know your book's primarily descriptive. You're describing some things that are going on, but you do make some prescriptions based off of the data, some suggestions. As I was reading this, look, I'm a father of a girl. She's only 2, but when I was reading, I was getting really depressed for her. It's like, man, that's a rough world you're going into, and I don't want her to have to go to these crazy extremes that you highlight in the book. Of having to be really hyper sensitive about how she looks, and just kind of have to go through all this rigmarole with guys who are kind of flaky. Yeah. So, any advice for parents out there who have daughters that they can help prepare them for a fulfilling romantic life and eventually a family life without all the stress that a lot of women are facing today?
Well, this is advice, I guess, for the women themselves as well as for the parents. And I think one of them would be to kind of consider geography when you're settling down. So there are certain cities like Providence, Rhode Island, or New York City that are just particularly bad for women. And there are other cities like Seattle or San Francisco or San Jose or San Diego where the demographics are more women friendly. Now, the obvious caveat is that most people are not going to plan their whole lives around gender ratios. So, right. This is like advice, I think. If you had a daughter who was just graduating from college this coming May or June, I think that's the kind of thing you might want to be on her checklist if she's marriage minded. But again, I'm not assuming everybody is marriage minded. Another thing to keep in mind would be if you do want to get married and you put a high priority on marriage and becoming a mother. There's an advantage to getting serious about dating earlier rather than later. So I guess I interviewed, and I know a lot of women who decided to put all their focus on career in their 20s and early 30s and figured they would just meet somebody at 32 or 33. And I'm certainly not saying that that's a bad idea if you're career minded. I mean, it's a great idea if you're career minded. The problem is that if you start out in a lopsided dating pool, the numbers move against you over time, which is why holding out becomes a bad strategy. So I assume you and most of your listeners probably played musical chairs as a child.
Right.
Yeah. So as you may recall, in the first round of musical chairs, I mean, there's one fewer chair than players. But really in the first round, like everybody gets a chair except for the kid who's not paying attention, right?
Yeah.
But in the last round of musical chairs, you have a 50% chance of losing the game. And that's kind of what happens in dating. So I'm just going to use round numbers. If you start out with a dating pool that has 140 women and 100 men, which is 1.4 women for every one man, it starts out lopsided, but it gets worse over time. So once 70 of those women marry 70 of the men, the remaining dating pool becomes 70 single women versus 30 single men, which is a greater than 2-to-1 ratio. So I think this explains why in cities like New York and LA and Chicago, we all know these fabulous women in their 30s who can't seem to meet a decent guy. And it's not because they're not attractive or they're not good company or anything like that. It's because the demographics have moved against them. So this is a long-winded way of me saying, get serious about dating a little bit younger. It doesn't mean you have to have kids. I mean, I got married when I was 24 and I didn't have kids till I was 30.
Yeah.
But and then finally, and this gets back to what we talked about earlier, I think we all need to be more open-minded when it comes to educational background. The idea that a college degree makes you a better husband or a better wife. I mean, I don't think that's true. And I think we need to get past this idea that we can only date or marry people who are just like us. And in fact, not long after the book came out, I got a Twitter message from a woman who told me she met her husband of 4 or 5 years after she unchecked the college graduate box on her online dating site.
Interesting. So yeah, just kind of help your daughters realize you can marry a firefighter who doesn't have a college degree, but he's a good, solid dude.
Exactly.
Gotcha. So as I was reading this too, I mean, it seems like the man deficit, if you're a man, you're a young guy in your 20s or even, in your 40s, it sounds like it could be an unmitigated boon for you if what you're looking for is just as many sexual relationships as possible. But it seems like the downside would be that there are guys who might be, they want to settle down. They have that in mind, but it could cause them to be too picky and they just don't settle down because they're trying to maximize wife, I guess, material. I don't know. That's kind of a dumb way to put it. Is that a problem?
I have a friend who wrote a much talked about story for the New York Times a couple of weeks ago about this very topic. And he's a Manhattan man in his early 30s, his early 40s, who he's been enjoying the single life for a while, but now all of his friends are married and he's kind of feeling lonely. So there is this kind of issue of men who don't know when it's time to stop.
So, I mean, any suggestions for them? Just kind of, they have to decide like, okay, I'm going to get married by this age. And so they can get out of that loop of trying to maximize. I don't know.
I don't know. Like,
Yeah, you don't know.
I tried carefully. I'm not assuming everybody wants to get married,
Right.
or everybody's heterosexual, or
Right.
I mean, certain, no doubt, marriage is not for everyone. I mean, I acknowledge that. So some of these guys might be better off never getting married. Some women may be better off never getting married too. But I guess what I would say is that if you do want to get married someday, and you're with somebody who truly makes you happy and who you're compatible with, don't treat the relationship casually just because you know that there are many more fish in the sea.
That makes perfect sense. Common sense advice there. So, Jon, this has been a really fascinating conversation, and there's a lot more we could talk about, but I know you have to go. Where can people learn more about your book?
Well, my website is date-onomics.com, DATEONOMICS.com. The book's available for sale at all your local booksellers, bookstores, online at Amazon and BarnesandNoble.com. If you Google me or the book title, you'll find speeches and interviews and news stories and the like.
Awesome. Well, Jon Birger, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Brett.
My guest today was Jon Birger. He's the author of the book Date-onomics, and you can find out more information about the book at date-onmics.com, and you can find it on Amazon.com and bookstores everywhere.